Okay, and it
I'm gonna
looks
stop video as well.
okay. Looks like it's 10:02. So I'll give a few more minutes until I start the presentation. And it looks like it's streaming on Facebook, so that's good. If you're tuning in on Facebook, I'm just going to give a few more minutes because, you know, it's a Saturday morning, so I run a little while to get on. And if you're in the Zoom meeting, if you could just mute yourself so that you're not your face is not on Facebook, because we are streaming this to Facebook Live. But hello, welcome. Thank you for coming on Saturday morning to talk about housing discrimination. I'll probably start the presentation at 10:05 just so that any not morning people have a chance to get on for the beginning. Okay, it's 10:05, so I will begin. Thank you for being on time. No worries if you're someone who's running late and you show up a little later. Today's presentation, once I can hit present, is about housing discrimination in our lives. So to start, hi, my name is Nicole Grennan. I'm the community educator organizer with Erase Racism. Erase Racism is a regional nonprofit organization which focuses on racial equity in education, housing on Long Island. Our mission is to expose forms of racial discrimination, advocate for laws and policies that eliminate racial disparities, increase an understanding of how structural racism and segregation impact our communities and region, and engage the public in fostering equity and inclusion. Since 2001, we've been mobilizing Long Islanders to successfully expose and remedy racial discrimination and segregation in our region. So what we're going to be discussing today is examples of housing discrimination, looking at the Fair Housing Act, both federally and more locally, and the myths and realities of housing discrimination. And why are we discussing these things? It's really important for us to have these conversations, as it not only helps us to better protect ourselves and our families from housing discrimination, but also we can spread the word in our communities to ensure that we take actionable steps against housing discrimination. So if at any point you have a question, please use the chat feature. If you're in the Zoom meeting, if you're on Facebook, I'll try to check periodically. But again, if you're in the conversation and you have a question in the Zoom meeting, if you unmute and you speak, then your face will show up on the Facebook stream. So feel free to use the chat, and you can drop questions at any point. So we're going to start by looking at Long Island. So in the chat, you can write true or false. I know we're a small group, but it's fine. Is Long Island a diverse and integrated region? Long Island is a diverse and integrated region. So looking at the chat, I see one person said false. And the other person said false, not integrated. Yep, that's correct. So Long Island is actually one of the most segregated regions in the country. We're the 10th most segregated metro region in the United States. So this is not an accident, and we're gonna look at why this is. So a short history of Long Island's housing discrimination. Starting in the 1930s, let me let someone in. The federal government had a policy of developing housing that was racially segregated. Some of you may have heard of Levittown in Nassau County. This is an example of that development. In the 1940s, William Levitt and his company bought land on Long Island, which was an area of potato farms. And within just a few years, they were able to develop the land into mass-scale affordable homes, and they built a total of 17,400 homes. So this is a huge feat. This is incredible. But the issue with the Levittown development and other developments like it were that non-white homebuyers were explicitly blocked from accessing the homes in Levittown, including GIs, so the soldiers returning from World War II. There were a series of practices which limited access to the houses, including what is known as racial covenants in the deeds and the leases of the homes. And there was also a federal policy of racial discrimination that was embraced by the banking, insurance, and real estate industries, and redlining, which we're going to look at in a bit. So, in fact, in the 1960 census, 0% of Levittown's 82,000 residents were African American. And in 2017, just 1.73% were African American. So even though this racial discrimination looks like it was just happening in the 1940s and 50s, we're going to look at how it's possible that so few people still live in so few Black people still live in Levittown today, and how that relates to this history. So this on the screen right now is an example of a racial covenant. This would be the section of the home deed or lease that explicitly states that Levittown refused access to non-white homebuyers. And thanks to explicit federal policy requiring racially segregated housing, Levittown was only for members of the Caucasian race. So basically, the federal government said to William Levitt that they would not fund his housing project unless it was racially segregated. So I'm just going to read this sentence in the deed, because I know it's kind of fuzzy. So it says, no property in said addition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. So it's saying that both Black people or any person of color cannot buy this house. They also can't buy it as a resale. So if you're a white person who wants to sell to a person of color, you can't do that. You can't rent it to a person of color. And if you look in the original Levittown deeds, you will find these racial covenants. So the racial covenants and the federal government requiring racially segregated housing in order to provide funding for these is one way that housing segregation started in this history, especially in Long Island. But the other way housing discrimination was perpetuated was by the practice known as redlining. So the federal government created a system of color-coded maps to identify which communities were worthy of government-backed loans. So you can see on the screen that there's a map with different colors. A community with red was considered risky. A community with green was considered safe. And riskiness was not based on the residents' ability to pay, but it was based on the presence of Black residents. So red neighborhoods were actually denied access to affordable loans, and Black families were not allowed to live in white neighborhoods or like green neighborhoods. Majority white neighborhoods were identified as safe neighborhoods, even when the area's income or ability to pay was lower than that of majority Black middle income neighborhoods. So I'll say that one more time. Majority white neighborhoods were identified as safe. They were color coded as green, even if the area's income or ability to pay was lower than that of majority Black middle income neighborhoods. So in that way, the process of redlining, it produced the results that it claimed it was sort of like preventing or addressing. It made it so that these red communities could not pay, when in fact, at the get-go, that was not true. So even though this practice was made illegal, its effects are still seen today in residential segregation. And this practice was led again by the federal government, and it was upheld by banks and real estate agencies. And so if you look, there are redline maps of the whole tri-state area. There are actually no redlined maps of Long Island because there weren't enough Black people living on Long Island for there to be redline maps. So I have another activity, so you can put your answer in the chat, true or false. Black people only want to live with Black people, which is why they are so segregated. So you can put your response in the chat, whether you think this is true or false. Okay. I see 2 false in the chat. So that's correct. The answer is false. The fact is that most Black people prefer racially integrated communities. So something you might hear often is like self-segregation. Black people only want to live with other Black people, and that's why Long Island is so segregated. But for the past 19 years, Erase Racism, actually 20 years now, Erase Racism has documented how housing discrimination plays a significant role in determining the neighborhoods where African Americans on Long Island will most likely reside. And studies have also shown that even the most affluent Black and Hispanic homebuyers are segregated into majority Black and Hispanic communities with high concentrations of poverty. Studies about neighborhood preferences often pose questions about whether so-called self-segregation is at play by all racial groups, including Blacks, not structural racism. So it's like pinning the problem on individual choice rather than this system of segregation we have. So in response to this assertion, we did some research. We asked a large pool of Black Long Islanders about the characteristics they value in a neighborhood. And our questions included perceptions of their current neighborhood and thoughts about their ideal neighborhood. And we also asked about personal experiences with housing and discrimination and a desire to stay in or move away from Long Island. And so this is what the survey yielded. So we partnered with Stony Brook University Center for Survey Research, and we conducted the survey in 2011. It was the largest survey of Black Long Islanders to include questions about housing-related issues. So the survey respondents were people from neighborhoods in Nassau and Suffolk counties, which had a population which was at least 60% African Americans. So we interviewed these segregated communities where they were majority Black. 90% of those interviewed had lived on Long Island for at least 10 years. Respondents shared that with us that the prevalence of segregation on Long Island makes it difficult for African Americans to find areas with the ideal racial mix. And you can see here on the screen that 69% of respondents chose an even mix of 50% white and 50% Black as ideal. So that's like a very integrated community. Only 1% of the respondents said that they would like to live in a neighborhood that is all Black. So that's an extreme minority of respondents who say that they would like to self-segregate. And roughly 4 in 10 African Americans would live in a mostly white community if schools had a mix of Black and white students. And the final note on this survey is that some respondents in the survey shared that they felt they had been discriminated against in the purchase of their home. So another true-false question. Black and Hispanic people have lower incomes, and that is the main reason for their segregation in lower income, racially segregated communities with concentrated poverty. So again, you can put in the chat what you think the answer is. I see some false. Some more false. Okay, yeah, so this is false. The fact is that the average affluent Black or Hispanic household actually lives in a poorer neighborhood than the average low-income white resident. So while Long Islanders do have different average income levels based on race, it's not true that all higher income white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian people live together and so on. So we're not segregated by income on Long Island. Given that Black people prefer integrated communities, which our survey with Stony Brook showed, this pattern of racial segregation, regardless of income, suggests that factors other than income are contributing to the high levels of racial segregation. In fact, the average affluent Black or Hispanic household lives in a poorer neighborhood, which is what it says on the screen. So now we're going to look at what housing law currently exists in the country, what can be done to address segregation, and what's already being done and how we can bolster those efforts. So the Fair Housing Act was an act by the federal government, passed by Congress and signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The Fair Housing Act was enacted on April 11th, 1968, in response to protests across the country following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The law prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing against people with specific protected characteristics. And we're going to look at those characteristics in a moment. It is part of the historic Civil Rights Act of 1968. And the law states, to ensure that no person shall be subjected to discrimination in the sale, rental, or advertising of dwellings, in the provision of brokerage services, or in the availability of residential real estate related transactions. So, so that's the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But this idea about fair housing is not new. The idea that unfair housing should be illegal actually goes back to 1866. And there are some exemptions, but the 1866 law was deemed to be this nation's first fair housing law when a case was decided by the Supreme Court 3 months after the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. And it is routinely used to challenge discrimination to this day. It's a one-sentence law, so I'll just read it. All citizens of the United States shall have the same right in every state and territory as is enjoyed by white citizens, thereof to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property. So that was the original fair housing law. Clearly, there were a lot of violations. So in 1968, they passed the Fair Housing Act. And now the question is, who do you think is protected by the Fair Housing Act? Before I tell you what characteristics are protected by the Fair Housing Act, I would like for you to put some of your ideas in the chat. What do we think that the Fair Housing Act specifically protects against discrimination? So you can, again, put in the chat what you think. I see race or ethnicity. Protects all of us, but those of African American, Hispanic background. Great, okay. So I'll go on to look at so the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination based on the following characteristics. race, color, sex, religion, national origin, handicap, and family status. And so this is a federal law. This applies in all of the states, but individual states have additional protected categories as well. And we'll cover New York and Suffolk County a little bit later in the presentation. But for now, we're going to talk a little more about what the Federal Fair Housing Act protects. So the first goal of the Fair Housing Act is to end discrimination in the renting or selling of homes or apartments. So for example, there's a notice in New York State that discusses your rights through fair housing, whether you are buying or renting. The office or realtor you go to should actually have that information available, as well as your rights as a home buyer. So we're going to look at these protections throughout the presentation, but I'm going to put on the screen what that looks like, what you should expect to see if you go to a realtor's office. So you see it's a fair housing notice. It lists the protected characteristics of New York State, which are actually many more than the federal protected characteristics. And the notice also shares examples of fair housing violations, which we'll discuss in a minute. Even though this document is only available in English at the moment, it will be available in other languages eventually. And the notice ends with information on how to file a complaint and information about the offices, one of which is right here in Hauppauge. The sign must be posted in all real estate broker offices and at all public houses. So that's your right as a home buyer, is to have this information accessible to you when you're buying a home. So the next question becomes, what acts or activities are illegal under the Fair Housing Act, specifically in terms of renting or selling homes or apartments? Again, I'll ask the group to share your thoughts. I'll give you a minute to put your responses in the chat. What acts or activities are illegal under the Fair Housing Act? Specifically with respect to selling or renting homes or apartments. So I see discrimination against any one of the protected groups listed in the last slide. Definitely. I'll give a minute for some more ideas. Specifically showing homes and apartments. Yeah, great. In addition to what was mentioned in the chat, here are some other, some of the things that are prohibited under the Federal Fair Housing Act. I'm just going to read through them. Refusing to rent, sell, or negotiate for housing, making housing unavailable or lying about the availability, denying housing, establishing different terms or conditions in selling or renting, providing different accommodations or amenities, block busting, denying participation in housing-related services based on your protected characteristics. So that's an important piece. Meaning, for example, it is illegal to refuse to rent somebody an apartment because they are Black, but it's not illegal to refuse to rent somebody an apartment because they can't afford the apartment. So just because you don't get a specific apartment, that doesn't necessarily mean it's housing discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. And this applies to many different types of housing, such as single-family homes, apartments, and multifamily homes. So that last clause, based on your protected characteristic, is a really important part. And then some other examples include falsely denying that housing is available for inspection, sale, or rental, making, printing, or publishing any notice, statement, or advertisement with respect to the sale or rental of a dwelling that indicates a preference, limitation, or discrimination, imposing different sales prices or rental charges for the sale or rental of a dwelling, using different qualification criteria or applications, like having different income standards, application requirements, fees, credit analyses, or sale or rental approval procedures from person to person. Evict a tenant or a tenant's guest, harass a person, fail or delay performance or maintenance of repairs, limit privileges, services, or facilities, discourage the purchase of a rental or dwelling, assign a person to a particular building or neighborhood or section of a building or neighborhood, and deny access to or membership in any multiple listing service, real estate, or real estate brokers organization. So these are a few of the other examples of discrimination when it comes to renting or selling homes or apartments. And of course, again, this is all based on your protected characteristics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about harassment and retaliation, but really quick, I want to make sure, does anyone have any questions about what's on the screen right now, or anything that I just mentioned? You can put it in the chat. Okay, if anyone thinks of questions, you can put it in the chat at any time, or we can go back to it at the end. Oh, there's one question. So why does discrimination continue in this area? We will get to that. So I will answer that one by saying stay tuned. So to elaborate a little bit on harassment and retaliation, tenant on tenant harassment and neighbor on neighbor harassment is illegal when it is based on a protected characteristic. But proving these claims can be challenging, especially under the Fair Housing Act. So things like cross burning and vandalism can usually be covered under the criminal section of the 1968 Civil Rights Act. And then severe or pervasive name calling, comments made, or conduct based on a protected characteristic may be covered under the Fair Housing Act. But what's tricky is largely this falls on the person to prove that it's as a result of some protected characteristic. So we recommend, if you think that you're being discriminated against, we'll say this a lot throughout the presentation, that you reach out to an expert. And we will provide you with the numbers and contact info of some housing experts that we are connected with. So I want to play this video from Newsday. It was from the Long Island Divided study, which was published in 2019. The study found that housing discrimination still happens today. And at a rate that may surprise us. So the video shows us how two different people, a white homebuyer and a black homebuyer, were treated differently by the same real estate agent. It's also important to remember that both homebuyers have the same financial background. So they did paired testing, and everything is the same for the two testers. So we're gonna watch it and then we'll discuss your thoughts afterwards.
The home buying experience for Blacks was a sharply different experience than it was for whites in our testing. We conducted 39 match tests involving Black testers. In 19 of those tests, the Black tester experienced unequal treatment. That is 49% of the time.
Every place I went to, basically, they treated me very well, and they showed me that, you know, they were really interested in what I wanted.
But it was only after they got back to the office and compared them that we noticed that the treatment wasn't equal.
I think what I am surprised at is the sheer discrepancy between the two of us.
I like Freeport. So a lot of people who say to me, oh, I don't care, I'll take Freeport, and all the houses are cheap there. I don't care about the school district, I don't have any children. I said, but you gotta protect your investment.
After looking at the area that she went to and the area that I went to and all the nice choices that she had so much more than I did, I felt I was slighted a little bit.
As Black testers, they were getting directed to more diverse neighborhoods, or that they weren't getting equal service compared with white counterparts.
Every time I see and hear things like that, I'm still like very surprised.
Etri declined to comment. Coldwell Banker stated, incidents reported by Newsday that are alleged to have occurred more than 2 years ago are completely contrary to our long-term commitment and dedication to supporting and maintaining all aspects of fair and equitable housing. Lisa Culpo, a young Black female tester in a particular test, she was asked for identification proving who she was.
Well, I do need a copy of your license. Oh, or something, some form of ID.
The thing is, because I've gone on so many tests where they have never asked me for ID, well, why would they need ID?
All right, but this is routine. I mean, this is something that's not unusual.
Yeah, no, that's what we do with everyone.
Because,
If you want to give it, you
okay.
don't forget I'm going out.
It's
Stranger also, so we just identification.
that didn't happen when her white matched pair counterpart went in to the same agent and asked for the same criteria.
All of these surrounding areas are great, and they're great for your commute, and they're great for your husband.
And Lisa's listings were in more diverse neighborhoods like Hicksville and East Meadow. Her white counterparts' listings were in more white communities. Petrelli declined to comment. Kelvin Toon is a Black man in his early 50s, and he went in to meet with an agent involving a test in the Brentwood community, a community that is 80% Hispanic and Black. The agent communicated to Kelvin, our Black tester, that she enjoyed meeting with clients from the Brentwood area.
Every time I get a new listing in Brentwood or a new client, I get so excited because they're nice people.
When we sent Kelvin's counterpart in to meet with the same agent, the white tester was actually warned about Brentwood not being a nice place.
The nursing home we need to be near is in Brentwood.
Okay.
And so we found a couple that are in Brentwood.
Pretty close to each other.
Okay. And it just seemed like those would be handy also for going
Do you
to
want to
visit.
give me them and I'll look into them for you? Or?
Yeah, I can do that.
That warning came later to the white testers saying there was concern about gang activity going on in Brentwood. This agent wanted the white tester to know about, but that information wasn't provided to Kelvin, the Black tester. The listings centered Black tester Kelvin in Brentwood with 27 house listings, while the white tester got 0 listings in Brentwood.
I mean, she's telling him these some of the nicest clients I've ever worked with, et cetera, et cetera. He's steering me away from that. And not only in the listing she sent me, but also in telling me that about the gang violence.
Vickery said she had warned only the white tester about gang activity because she had not been aware of it when she met with the Black tester, despite widespread media coverage. She also said her business partner, Gene Gillen, sent the listings to the Black tester. Gillen said the listings were unquestionably prepared based on Vickery's criteria, and that Vickery may have sent the listings using Gillen's email. She said she didn't know the race of the Black tester until she met him later on a house tour. Keller Williams, which was their employer at the time, released this statement. Keller Williams does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. All complaints of less than exemplary conduct are addressed and resolved. What we found when we looked at the total number of listings, agents provided 50% fewer listings to Black testers on average than to their white counterparts.
So I'm going to show another video, but before I do, was there anything that surprised anyone? If so, you can put in the chat. Any feelings that anyone had? Also, I see that someone wrote, please explain blockbusting. I will. So some of the reactions I see are Sadly, not surprised. Yeah, so we can see from the video that even when a real estate agent might be treating us kindly, they still may be offering us some differential treatment. So it may be impossible to know if your treatment is different from another person's unless you set up a paired test. Nonetheless, though, it's important to be aware of the strategies that have been used previously, such as steering people to certain communities. So we have a second video from the same Newsday study. This video focuses on the denial of equal service. So in this video, white homebuyers were allowed to see homes and listings, but Black, Hispanic, and Asian homebuyers faced obstacles, such as getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a loan, which the white homebuyers did not have to face. So we'll take a look and we'll again discuss after.
In Newsday's investigation of real estate practices on Long Island, we discovered that agents engaged in disparate treatment that amounted to denial of equal service.
Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
They imposed additional stipulations on the minority testers that they did not impose on the white tester. For example, they would tell a minority tester that the minority tester needed to be pre-qualified for a mortgage in order to receive either listings or to get a tour of homes.
So you need that.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Can't even look at listings or anything.
I wouldn't know what to show you.
However, that same stipulation was not imposed on the white tester.
Is it possible to for you to start sending me some listings?
I can send you listings in those areas.
Particularly Blacks were on the receiving ends of this unequal treatment. In one test, Johnny Mae Austin was the Black tester and Cindy Parry was the white tester. And they met with Anne Marie Quealy-Bichon at Signature Premier Properties office in Cold Spring Harbor.
You know, I don't know my way around out here.
They asked for the same thing. As often happens, the agent discussed getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a mortgage by a bank, showing how much a buyer can spend on a house.
You pre-qualified, I asked. My husband's working with somebody in the bank, and he will obtain a pre-approval from the mortgage lender.
Neither had been pre-approved or pre-qualified. Here's what the agent told the Black tester.
So I really need that. I won't take out any money unless you have a pre-qualification limit. So I need to know that I can't pre-qualify for a mortgage. Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
And without pre-approval, here's what the agent told the white tester.
What is your availability? When can we start looking at houses? I would say not this coming week.
Cindy received 79 listings from this agent. Johnny Mae couldn't get any listings.
Let's meet 11:30. Would you rather come with me? Rather than follow me? Yeah, okay, good. I'll make sure my car is sparkling for you.
And Cindy, the white tester, received 2 home tours. Bichon did not respond to requests for comment. Another test involved the Black tester, Kelvin Toon, who was going to see an agent by the name of Aminta Abarca at Keller Williams in Garden City.
You call with your wife and you'll sign the commitment.
Over the course of 2 visits, Abarca stressed the need to sign an exclusive buyer's agreement.
If we have a contract, then I'm working exclusively for you.
Without the contract, she refuses to take him on a tour of homes. So as Kelvin is driving back from his aborted meeting with the agent, Kelvin's counterpart, the white tester, receives a voicemail from the agent asking him when can he go out on a tour of homes.
Hi, David. How are you? This is Aminta. I'm just calling to see if you've started to do some house hunting now that these are over.
She ultimately takes the white tester without him signing any kind of exclusive agreement with her.
West Hempstead, we saw 2 in West Hempstead. The
Yeah.
2 family one,
Yeah.
okay?
Right.
And then we saw the beautiful renovated one.
Abarca did not respond to requests for comment. Keller Williams' national spokesman wrote in an emailed statement, Keller Williams does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. All complaints of less than exemplary conduct are addressed and resolved.
I have coordinated more than 12,000 investigations across the country. I have personally done over 1,500 tests. If I go into a real estate office and I say, I'm looking for a house in this price range, I work for this employer and I make this kind of money, generally my word is taken. And I'm not asked to show pay stubs. I'm not asked to go get pre-qualified by a lender. I'm not asked to do a variety of things. But an African-American man matched with me may well be grilled about his financial circumstances, may be asked to be pre-qualified. It suggests that African Americans and other people of color are not always taken at their word for what they can afford.
In the meantime, I will wait for that pre-approval from your friend or whoever you feel comfortable with. When I get that, I know you are serious about buying.
It certainly has major consequences for that person and their opportunity to obtain housing.
Perez declined comment. The company Perez worked for at the time of the test, Remax LLC, wrote that franchise owners have taken issues raised by Newsday seriously and are committed to following the law and promoting levels of honesty, inclusivity, and professionalism. A law firm representing Douglas Elliman Real Estate, where Perez now works, said Perez dealt more readily with the white tester because he said he consulted a friend working for a mortgage company, while the Asian tester had talked with a friend retired from a mortgage lender. This point is critical, a firm partner wrote. In 7 of Newsday's 86 paired tests, the agent's conduct amounted to a denial of equal service. That affected 5 of Newsday's Black testers, 1 Hispanic tester, and 1 Asian tester.
So was there anything about this video that surprised anyone? I saw that some people are familiar already with the Newsday study. Or maybe you weren't surprised. How did this make you feel? So one comment in the chat is, I didn't realize how smooth agents are to hide the discrimination. And another comment is, so troubled about the subtle differences in the denial on the part of the realtors. Yeah, so the realtors, they are smooth about it. And it's possible, like, some of them, it's just their implicit bias that they didn't realize they had. And then some of them, it's obvious, explicit discrimination. Either way, whether it's implicit bias that they don't realize they're discriminating, either way it's illegal. So they still have to be held accountable. So following the Newsday investigation, just for anyone who hasn't been following the result of it, the New York State Senate launched an investigation. They had a trial in December of 2019 or January of 2020. And they invited all the realtors to come testify. None of the realtors showed up, not one of them. So then they had another hearing in September of 2020, and they subpoenaed the realtors. And pretty much all the realtors denied discrimination. Like, the Senate would play the video, they would explain how that's housing discrimination, and the realtors would deny it. And at that time, none of them had lost their job or faced consequences from their agencies. Elaine Gross, Erase Racism's president and founder, was one of the fair housing experts who testified before the New York State Senate at that hearing. So the fact is that in many ways, this is how housing discrimination is perpetuated. Because even though there are fair housing laws, there isn't very strong enforcement. Of course, that's something that we're working on. So again, in response to this investigation, the New York State Senate recently passed 11 bills, and now they're in the Assembly waiting for the assembly bills to be written and passed. But they deal with increasing the accountability of realtors and real estate brokers, and increasing funding for fair housing testing, and really bolstering the fair housing laws that we have in place so that people are actually held to account to following them. So that's kind of what has come of this Newsday study. But we're going to keep looking at the other parts of the Federal Fair Housing Act for now. And I also want to touch on blockbusting. So blockbusting was a practice where, also known kind of as white flight, real estate agents would tell the white homeowners in a community that Black people were going to move in and the value of their home was going to decrease tremendously. And then they would have the white people would sell their home at less than it was valued at, and then the real estate agents would sell it to Black home buyers for more than it was valued at. So they would make a profit by instilling fear in the white home sellers about the value of their property. So that is illegal, clearly, but a lot of those myths still prevail today. Like, you might hear someone say that the value of their property is tied to who lives in the neighborhood, which is not true. It's been disproven many times, but it's a myth that blockbusting created, and that still prevails as long as it's not corrected. So, come on, here we go. So the second goal of the Federal Fair Housing Act is to end discrimination in mortgage lending. When we're talking about redlining, one of the reasons that it was so successful was that if you lived in a red line neighborhood, there was no access to affordable mortgages. So discrimination in who gets access to mortgages and the mortgage rates people have access to determines their ability to pay. So let's examine what's protected under the law. What acts or activities, why is it moving, are illegal under the Fair Housing Act in mortgage lending? Some things that are prohibited under the Fair Housing Act include refusing to make a mortgage loan, setting different terms or conditions for a mortgage, interest rates or fees, setting different requirements for mortgage loan purchases, refusing to make information about mortgage loans available, discriminatory practices and property appraising based on your protected characteristics. So again, that's an important clause, that these are all prohibited because of your protected characteristics. So for example, again, it is illegal to refuse to provide a mortgage to somebody because they are Black. However, it's not illegal to refuse a mortgage to somebody if they simply do not qualify for the mortgage. Additionally, it is illegal for a bank to refuse a mortgage loan based on the racial makeup of an area or community. So that is illegal. And that kind of goes hand in hand with blockbusting. This belief that certain communities have less ability to pay or that they decrease the value of homes in that community. That's all illegal. So we have another video. This one is an example of a study.
Most self-employed and
It's an example from Marquette University in Wisconsin, which shows how mortgage lenders across the country discriminate against people of different races. So even though this is in Wisconsin, it's not an isolated case. We know that these patterns persist throughout the country and on Long Island. So I'm going to share a different screen. Okay.
discriminating against minorities.
With the help of a Marquette University study, the I-Team uncovered troubling statistics in the way minority home buyers are treated.
Investigative reporter Eric Ross live at Marquette tonight to explain, Eric.
Good evening. While this 18-page study done by Marquette University reveals lending discrimination on a nationwide spectrum, tonight we're investigating whether it's happening right here in our own backyard. And what we found may, or quite frankly, may not surprise you.
I have bought 3 homes before. I have not been discriminated because of my last name. It doesn't sound like an African-American.
Tracy DiDonatella says her name has helped her avoid discrimination, but for many Americans, that's not the case.
It's something that you hear about. You see news clips, you see lawsuits.
Marquette University professor Dr. Andrew Hansen is the lead author behind this study on mortgage lending discrimination.
There's a small segment of the market that definitely treat minorities differently.
Hansen sent emails to more than 5,000 mortgage loan officers across the country. The emails were similar, asking for information on current mortgage rates and loan options. The only difference, the name of the person sending the inquiry.
They each get an email inquiry from one white-sounding name and one African-American sounding name, and then we see, do they treat them differently?
The results, Black-sounding names received fewer responses from loan officers. For example, emails from Jake Kruger got a response 72% of the time, compared to Deshaun Banks, who only received a response 62% of the time. Loan officers also sent fewer follow-up emails to inquiries from African-American sounding names.
Prior to doing the study, what I thought was, what I would find is there's no discrimination, right? This is something that happened 50, 60 years ago.
The people we spoke with in Milwaukee are not surprised by the findings.
I don't think it's right at all, but what can I do? I think, what I'm saying, everybody deserves a fair try, what I'm saying, no matter the color or race.
Discriminatory lending practices during the 2004 to 2008 housing boom resulted in 2 of the largest cash settlements ever between mortgage lenders and the Department of Justice. $335 million from Countrywide, now affiliated with Bank of America, and $175 million from Wells Fargo.
They're doing something that isn't right. It isn't fair.
The I-Team decided to copy Marquette University's study with local mortgage lenders. Using one white and one Black-sounding name, we emailed 10 lenders asking about loans. Ethan Schmidt, a name commonly associated with a white male, received a response 90% of the time, but Jermaine Booker only received a response in 80% of our inquiries. Wisconsin Mortgage Corporation in Brookfield never replied to Jermaine's inquiry. But less than 6 hours after receiving an inquiry from Ethan, a compliance manager responded saying she was out of town and one of her loan officers would be in touch. The very next day, a senior loan officer followed up. We contacted the company's vice president for answers. He declined to talk on camera, but in an email, he acknowledged inquiries from both subjects were received, but says a loan officer was never alerted to contact Jermaine Booker due to a computer system error. He goes on to say the company is now doing some additional testing to make sure this doesn't happen again.
That can still impact a home purchase. You're not going to get a loan quick enough, right? And you might not have a real estate agent that's interested, or you may miss out on the preferred house. Mortgage discrimination is illegal.
Now, if you're denied a loan, you legally have the right to know why. Consumer experts always encourage you to pull your credit report first before applying for a loan. That way you could look for inaccuracies. Inaccuracies in your credit report could result in a lower score. And of course, that could impact whether or not you ultimately get approved for a line of credit to take out a mortgage. Now, if you feel you've been discriminated against in any portion of the lending process, we walk you through who to contact and what to do on our website. Just head over to tmj4.com. For now, reporting live at Marquette University, Eric Ross, today's TMJ4.
Eric, good information. Thanks so much.
Great. So, again, just to reiterate, even though this takes place in Wisconsin, this video is set in Wisconsin, we know that this happens all over the place. In myriad ways, right? Like there have been other studies done where they test for job interviews. They send resumes with different names, and they find that people who have more white sounding names get more callbacks, even when everything else is the same. So that's on mortgage lending under the Federal Fair Housing Act. The third goal of the Federal Fair Housing Act is that it makes it unlawful to make discriminatory statements or advertise property that expresses a preference for certain backgrounds or excludes a protected characteristic. And it makes it unlawful to threaten to interfere with anyone's fair housing right, even after a person or family moves in. And it's important to note that even individuals have to abide by the Fair Housing Act. So if we live in a single family home or an apartment building, there could be Fair Housing Act lawsuits against individuals as well, not just real estate agents or governments. So we're all protected by the Fair Housing Act, but we're also all liable by the Fair Housing Act. And as I mentioned earlier, if you feel you have been discriminated against, make the call. If discrimination does take place, the burden is on the buyer or the renter to prove it. But if you make the call to a fair housing service, the county or the state, there are experts who will help you understand your specific situation and circumstances, and they will guide you along in the process. So here are some important numbers that you can keep on your phone. You can feel free to take a picture of the screen right now, or you can write them down, or I will put this up again at the end of the workshop. So the first is the Suffolk County Human Rights Commission, which is the Suffolk County government who can take legal action against a realtor or real estate agency in Suffolk County. Then there's the Long Island Housing Services and the Fair Housing Justice Center, which are both nonprofit, non-governmental organizations that help people assess their housing discrimination cases. And you might remember in the Newsday video, Fred Freiberg is the executive director of the Fair Housing Justice Center. He was featured in the Newsday, and he was one of the other fair housing experts called on by the New York State Senate in September and last December. So at the state level, there is the New York State Division of Human Rights, and if the incident involved a licensed realtor, the New York State Division of Licensing Services. In fact, New York State just passed a law which would allow for the removal of a real estate agent's license based on discriminatory actions. And I'm going to move on, but again, these numbers are going to be on the presentation at the end as well. So I have another true/false question. Housing discrimination was outlawed under the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and discrimination does not happen today. So this one is kind of a gimme. Yeah, so I see some false. And we know that that's false. We just watched some videos. The Newsday report, Long Island Divided in 2019 showed housing discrimination on Long Island still occurs. So let's take a closer look at the 2019 study done by Newsday. The report showed that 19% of Asian homebuyers were discriminated against, 39% of Hispanic homebuyers were discriminated against, and 49% of Black homebuyers were discriminated against. So that's almost 1 in 2 Black homebuyers who's being discriminated against. Even in 2019, even in 2020, we continue to see how pervasive housing discrimination is on Long Island. So some more about Long Island today. These are some other instances that we've compiled besides the Newsday study that demonstrates some different examples of housing discrimination that still happens today. So Erase Racism has done similar testing to Newsday, and we looked at discrimination in rentals. So in 2014 and 2016, we filed suit with various plaintiffs addressing rental discrimination in Mineola and Smithtown. So what was essentially happening was the Black testers were being told that there's no vacancy or there's no availability, there's a very long line, and the white renters were being shown houses almost immediately. Additionally, in 2018, there was discrimination of financial services. So Suffolk Federal Credit Union reached a settlement with Long Island Housing Services for discriminating against African Americans and Latinx people looking for information about mortgage loans. And in 2014, the town of Oyster Bay was sued for a racially discriminatory affordable housing program. So the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York announced the filing of a federal civil rights lawsuit alleging that the town of Oyster Bay engaged in a pattern and practice of racial discrimination against African Americans in violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act. So they had an affordable housing law that gave preference to people who were already living in Oyster Bay. At the time, only 3% of Oyster Bay was Black. Only 1% of that 3% was income eligible for the housing. So in that way, Oyster Bay, the town of Oyster Bay, made an affordable housing program, but the program was still discriminatory. So those are just some examples of what still happens in Long Island. And like I said, the New York State Senate is taking some really meaningful steps to bolster our laws and our accountability. But it's structural racism. It just keeps perpetuating itself all the way from the Levittown developments to today. So in enacting the Fair Housing Act, Congress declared it is the policy of the United States to provide within constitutional limitations for fair housing throughout the United States. Newsday's investigative report, Long Island Divided, shows the promise expressed in the policy has yet to be realized. So at the time when the policy was passed, Congress directed HUD to make sure that neither the agency itself nor the cities, counties, states, and public housing agencies it funds discriminate in their program. The municipalities have the obligation to identify and remove barriers to address the embedded segregation. So what that basically means is that since it was caused by the government has to address it and take steps to reverse it. Congress also intended that HUD programs be used to expand housing choices and help make all neighborhoods places of opportunity, providing their residents with access to the community assets and the resources they need to flourish. So again, HUD programs are meant to advance fair housing and equitable access to housing. Sadly, too many jurisdictions have taken HUD funds but failed to fulfill their obligations to further the goal of advancing fair housing. And Newsday's investigative report is just one example of that promise expressed in the policy being yet to be realized. So we didn't have affirmatively fair housing. In fact, we had housing discrimination. So to pivot a little bit, switching from federal law to New York State law in Suffolk County, we see that the protected characteristics get progressively more expansive than those under the federal law. So in New York State, the Fair Housing Act works in cohesion with the New York State human rights laws to prevent discrimination. As such, renters and buyers in New York State receive a broader range of coverage than renters and buyers in locations without local anti-discrimination laws. Whereas these characteristics are protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act, the New York State human rights law adds marital status, age, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, lawful source of income, military status, and status as a victim of domestic violence. The Suffolk County law goes even further, adding group identity, meaning but not limited to actual or perceived age, citizenship status, gender and sexual orientation, and also adds explicitly citizenship status. And there are some additional exemptions which protect senior-only housing. But overall, this is the law. These are some of the exemptions for each of the laws. So Fair Housing Act, senior-only housing or owner-occupied for 4 units or less. New York State human rights law, owner-occupied housing with fewer than 2 units, and Suffolk County law, owner-occupied housing with fewer than 2 units. So these are some of the exemptions, but the exemptions, if you have a question about the exemption, you should just reach, if you're exempt or some housing that you're trying to buy might be exempt, you should just reach out to some of the experts that we put on the screen prior and who we will put on the screen again. So those are the different laws based on locale. Just as there are different protections at different levels of government, there are various levels of enforcement as well. So at the federal level, HUD and the U.S. Department of Justice are charged with enforcing the Federal Fair Housing Act. At the state level, it's the New York State Division of Human Rights. They protect New York State homebuyers alongside the New York Attorney General. So here on Long Island, we have both Suffolk and Nassau County Human Rights Commissions. And there are also private fair housing and civil rights organizations, which are throughout our community, like the Fair Housing Justice Center and Long Island Housing Services. Additionally, complaints and lawsuits can be filed by individuals, though we strongly recommend going through a pre-existing organization at the local or community level if possible. So even though people are segregated based primarily on race, families and individuals may face discrimination based on other factors. And one of the most recent protections is for lawful source of income. So often people receive income that does not come from a job. This is called non-wage income, and it includes child support, alimony, supplemental security income, and some of the other things on the screen right now. These are legal ways to pay for housing, but often get discriminated against. And if you live in New York City and you're watching this, there are additional public assistance programs that may benefit you. But it's important to know that if someone discriminates your ability to buy or rent a house because of your source of income, that is illegal. That's a protected characteristic. So in addition, there are protections for language access. Suffolk County has developed a language access plan as of 2012, which ensures that people with limited English proficiency have meaningful access to agency services, programs, and activities. Even though a real estate agent might not have materials in your language, any Suffolk County government office should have resources available in Spanish, Haitian Creole, and in addition, they should have Polish, Portuguese, Chinese, and Italian. And then for more information or for support, you can send an email to lep.coordinator@suffolkcountynewyork.gov. So we're going to test your memory skills a little bit. If you're watching through Facebook, you can just play at home. Again, I'm going to ask you to use the chat feature if you're in the Zoom call to submit your answers. So in 2019, Newsday found that real estate agents discriminated against Black homebuyers blank % of the time. Does anyone remember what that percent was? I see one response in the chat. Yeah, okay, great. So the answer is 49%. No worries if you can't remember, I'm bad at remembering numbers too. And then does anyone remember what it was against Latinx homebuyers and Asian homebuyers? Yeah. So it's true. It was not as bad, but still bad. The answer is 39% and 19%. So again, just to reiterate, it's clear that housing discrimination is still rampant even today. So sure, there were redlining and past federal policies that have been made illegal, but nonetheless, housing discrimination still prevails. And similar to Newsday's study, as we previously mentioned, Erase Racism has conducted paired tests of people looking for apartment rentals. In Mineola, Erase Racism and the Fair Housing Justice Center investigated a 75-unit apartment complex. The investigation revealed federal and county violations of fair housing law. The apartment complex lied about the availability of spaces, gave higher rates to African-American testers, and made apartments unavailable because of the testers' race. The case ultimately went up to federal court and resulted in successful settlements for the testers. And then in a similar test in Comac, Erase Racism and the Fair Housing Justice Center used paired testers to investigate a 107-unit apartment complex. The investigation revealed serious discrepancies in treatment, such as providing welcoming responses to white testers, while Black testers were lied to and not shown apartments even when they were available. So again, we had misrepresenting availability, not showing available apartments, and misrepresenting the dates of apartment availability. This town also went to federal court and was settled by the town of Smithtown. So not only is housing discrimination harmful for what I hope are obvious reasons at this point, but segregating housing also creates public school inequities. It creates school segregation. It creates a lack of access to resources, a lack of opportunities. It creates environmental or health concerns, wealth disparities, and disparate rates of homeownership. So erase racism focuses both on housing discrimination, but also on education inequity. And we're going to look a little bit at some data that we analyzed between 2004 and 2016. The first part of the data that we found is good. Schools on Long Island and students in Long Island schools are overall more diverse. So it went from being 70% white, 5% Asian, 13% Hispanic, 11% Black, to 55% white, 8% Asian, 25% Hispanic, 10% Black. So increased diversity is at its base a good thing. But despite these changes, the fact still remains that the number of students attending majority minority districts has more than doubled. So a majority minority district is a district that's 50 to 100% non-white. In 2004, that was 16% of districts, so 16 districts. In 2016, that number went up to 35%, so that's 39 districts. And for those majority minority districts that are intensely segregated, the number of students attending has nearly tripled. So an intensely segregated district is one that's 90 to 100% non-white. So in 2004, 22,000 students attended intensely segregated districts. In 2016, 65,000 students attended intensely segregated districts. The bottom line of our research was that 3 out of every 4 Black students and 2 out of every 3 Hispanic students attend a majority minority segregated school. And this might prompt the question, how is it possible that schools on Long Island are so segregated when Brown versus Board of Education said that school segregation is unconstitutional? Well, where you go to school depends on housing, and we have a lot of housing discrimination on Long Island, and very little housing discrimination enforcement, or fair housing enforcement rather. So this is why we are still in this predicament. So that's a little bit on education. I'm going to move now to health, how housing relates to healthcare. So white people on Long Island have died at a rate of 95.3 per 100,000 people from the COVID-19 pandemic. The age-adjusted rate of death for Black people on Long Island is blank per 100,000 people. Again, you can put your guess in the chat. So one guess we had is double. The answer is a little more than double, so 229.1 per 100,000. So we know that the population of Black people on Long Island, they're about like 13% of the population for Nassau and Suffolk combined. So how is it possible that they're dying at a rate of almost double due to COVID-19? Part of this is that healthcare is related to housing in a number of ways. So your education affects your job, which affects your likelihood to have healthcare or be a frontline worker. That's just one way of looking at the cycle, but there are myriad other ways. There's access to healthcare places. There's a number of other things. There's the discrimination that prevails also in the healthcare industry. So in that way, housing discrimination also impacts healthcare and people's right to life. So again, to pull this list up, segregated housing creates public school inequities, which we saw, lack of access to resources, including something like healthcare, lack of opportunities, which might lead to having healthcare, environmental or health concerns. This is another important one. I'm not sure if anyone is following what's happening with the Brookhaven landfill, but there is a landfill in Brookhaven that the town had said they were going to shut down. In August, they announced that they were going to open a new one. And this group, Blarg, has been doing a lot of work to prevent that. And the town recently announced that they were not going to go on with opening a new Asheville. But it's important to note that the people in Brookhaven, which is a majority people of color community, have the lowest life expectancy of anyone on Long Island, the people who are living by this landfill. It's about 10 years younger than the average life expectancy for all of New York State. So in that way, segregated housing creates environmental or health concerns, wealth disparities, and disparate rates of homeownership. So I hope that through this presentation, we've been able to illustrate the detrimental effects of segregated housing. And it's also important to note that besides the negative impacts, there are also proven benefits of integrated communities in education, healthcare, employment, and personal wealth creation. While this is a large systemic issue, we can all play a role in helping to dismantle these patterns. And already by attending today, you are helping to play a role in disrupting this pattern. So people are often hesitant to take action and raise their voices, but as you can see, there's a lot at stake for our communities, our children, and for you and I. So again, can't emphasize this enough. What should you do if you feel you have been discriminated against? Reach out, make the call for help. And I'm gonna put the numbers back up. And I'm gonna leave this on the screen for a minute before I stop sharing, but this is the conclusion of the presentation portion. So if you have any questions or concerns about anything that was mentioned in the presentation or anything else, you can feel free to put them in the chat. And in a minute, I'll check Facebook to see if there's any questions. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now. So one question is, will the recording be available on Facebook? Yes, this will be available on Facebook, you know, for till the end of time. Okay, I don't see any questions on Facebook. Anyone else have any questions about something I said, or any other questions you have about housing discrimination in general? One comment is make sure the Facebook video is shared and liked. Yep, that's one way to take action. Gotta go viral. Yeah, so if no one has any questions, you are all free to go enjoy your Saturday. I really appreciate you coming and making the time for such an important topic on your weekend. So, and if anyone has any questions that they think of later or comments, or you want to discuss something that we discussed here, you can reach out to me by email. My email is nicole@eraseracismny.org.